Welcome. Today, we are diving deep into a case that truly changed the game in international law. It all started with a tragic collision on the open ocean, but ended up redefining the very idea of national sovereignty. Yep, we're talking about the SS Lotus case. So, to really get a grip on this, we're going to walk through it just like a classic case digest. We'll start with what happened, look at the legal fight, and then unpack the court's landmark decision and the powerful principle it created. All right, let's get into it. So, our story begins on the high seas, where a sudden and, really tragic event set the stage for a huge international dispute. Okay, so check out how fast this all happened. On August 2nd, you have this terrible accident. The very next day, the French ship, the Lotus, pulls into port. And then, boom, just 2 days later, Turkish authorities arrest the French officer on watch, a man named Lieutenant Demons. He was then tried and sentenced in a Turkish court. Now, that arrest for something that happened way out on the high seas, well, that's what lit the fuse for this whole legal firestorm.
As you can imagine, France was not happy about this arrest. They protested immediately, and it led to this massive legal question that both countries agreed to settle at the Permanent Court of International Justice.
And here it is, the core of the whole dispute. Did Turkey have the right to do what it did? Did it overstep its bounds by prosecuting a French citizen for an incident that happened on the open ocean? The answer, it turns out, really hinged on two totally different ways of looking at how international law even works. This is where the legal battle really gets fascinating. France's position was, look, jurisdiction on the high seas belongs to the flag state, period. So Turkey has to point to a specific rule in international law that gives it permission to prosecute. But Turkey just flipped that argument right on its head. They said, no. As a sovereign state, we can do anything we want unless you can show us a rule that specifically forbids it. This whole reversal of who has to prove what, the burden of proof, that became the absolute heart of the case. So with these two completely opposing views laid out, the court finally delivered its judgment. And let me tell you, it was a close one. The judges were actually split right down the middle. It all came down to the president's casting vote. And with that, the court found that Turkey had not violated the principles of international law. So the bottom line was simple. Turkey's prosecution could stand. The key phrase here is not precluded. The court basically said that since there wasn't an existing rule of international law that stopped Turkey from doing what it did, its actions were permissible. But the why behind this? Well, that's what really cemented the Lotus case in the history books. To really get this ruling, we have to look at the court's step-by-step logic, its ratio decidendi. This reasoning basically redrew the map for how we understand state sovereignty. You can really see the court building its argument here. It starts with the basics. States are independent, and you can't enforce your laws in someone else's territory. But then comes the big leap. The court said a ship, the SS Bozkurt, is essentially an extension of Turkish territory. So because the effects of the negligence on the French ship were felt on the Turkish ship, which is like Turkish territory, Turkey had a valid link to claim jurisdiction. And since France couldn't point to a rule that said, you can't do this, Turkey was in the clear. In this quote right here, this is the soul of the decision. What's it saying? Basically, you can't just assume a sovereign country is restricted. Unless there is a clear, explicit rule saying no, a state is free to act. The burden was on France to show that such a prohibition existed, and they simply couldn't. And it's that line of thinking that gave us one of the most important, and frankly, most debated doctrines in all of international law. And there it is, the Lotus principle. This is the big takeaway. In a nutshell, it means that states have a green light to act unless there's a specific red light, a treaty, or a clear international custom telling them to stop. It's what's known as a permissive view of international law. So, after all that legal theory, what did this actually mean for Lieutenant Demons and for the case itself? Well, the agreement between France and Turkey asked two things. First was what Turkey did legal, and second, if it wasn't, how much should they pay in damages? Since the court's answer to question one was yes, Turkey's actions were not in conflict with international law, there was no need to even look at the second question. The issue of reparations for Lieutenant Demons was off the table. Case closed. The legacy of the SS Lotus is just immense. It stands as a powerful defense of state sovereignty. But it also leaves us wrestling with this really big question. In a world that's more connected than ever, where do you draw the line? Does this principle give states the freedom they need, or does it risk creating a free-for-all on the world stage? It's a question that lawyers and diplomats are still debating to this very day.